if you'd like.
Has anyone got any objections?
I'll just check my phone, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, let's us start. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this public meeting of the Select Committee of Tynwald on Dyslexia, Dyspraxia and other related services. I'm Rob Callister, MHK, Chair of this committee. With me this afternoon are Anne Corlett, MHK, and Dawn Kinnish, MLC. This committee was established to consider a petition of redress of grievance, which was presented to Tynwald Day last year. Today we're meeting with Dr Joyce Monroe, who is a chartered educational psychologist who used to work for the Department of Education, and in that role Dr Monroe wrote the Dyslexia Policy Report dated September 2012. Before I ask our guests to introduce themselves, can I ask that all mobiles are switched off or on silent, and do not, in order to ensure we don't have any interruptions. For the purpose of Hansard, I'll also be ensuring that we only have one person speaking at any given time. And please also be aware that this evidence will also be live streamed via Tynwald Live. Welcome, Dr Monroe. For the benefit of Hansard, anyone listening, could you please introduce yourself and in what capacity you're appearing today?
My name's Joyce Monroe, and I'm here as an educational psychologist.
Excellent, thank you. I was wondering if we could just start with asking you to give an overview of your professional background and your keen interest in dyslexia, if possible.
Yes. I trained as a teacher. I was brought up on the Isle of Man and went to Castle Rushen High School, and then went to train as a teacher and qualified as a secondary teacher of general science and biology. And then I taught first year in Cheshire in Middlewich, second year at Douglas High School for girls. I'm that old. And then I went travelling, taught in at Rodine in Johannesburg, South Africa for a year, then went to Australia and taught in Australia for a year, and then had my family. And then I went back to teaching when the youngest of my 4 children went to school, and got a job at Castle Rushen, then teaching general science. And I taught there for 10 years. And during that time, well, after a year at Castle Rushen, I elected the following year to teach all bottom set science. And that's what gave me a keen interest in psychology. I had some of the brightest children that I'd ever taught go through my hands, and they were all in bottom sets. So I did a psychology degree with the Open University while I was teaching, and then, it was because of one particular episode, said I'll become an educational psychologist. So then I went away and did a master's in educational psychology, and did my first year in Surrey, and then came back here to work for the department in about 2004, I think.
Okay, excellent. And what about dyslexia itself? What made you get interested in
that? I
that?
was teaching, that was what started me to try to work out what was going on. It was one cohort in particular. In the bottom set was taught in Lab 1X, and that only had 12 seats, so my maximum group size was 12. And the 12 children that came in, I don't remember which year, but I'd been there a year or two, they were virtually all non-readers and writers. And I thought, oh gosh, how am I going to teach them science with no literacy skills? And so I thought, this is such a common approach, really. I thought, well, I'll do it. I'll get them going. And I got the head of department to give me permission to not teach science for a bit. And I got some simple sciencey books. and got the children practicing reading and practicing doing worksheets and things on these books. And it made not a whit of difference. I still couldn't read and write after I'd finished, lots of time and lots of effort on the children's part. They were really keen and eager to do this. So that was my first experience of thinking, well, it sounds so easy, doesn't it? If somebody can't do something, give them more of that and they'll practice it, and then it'll be all right. And it wasn't. And then years later, so that was when they were in year 7, when they were in year 10, I was asked to start a GNVQ science course at Castle Rushen for the bottom sets. And that was hugely successful. I wasn't then teaching a lesson to the children. It was pupil-led. All their tasks and activities were, I'd organised them all as a filing cabinet. They could go and choose what they wanted to do out of. There were boxes of equipment that were already set up in the cupboards and things. And they led themselves. And the GNVQ course allowed children to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in any way that they could. They didn't demand reading and writing. And these children flourished. And in the year 11s that were doing it that year had a lot of truants. They started to come back in because it was great fun. We were doing brewing, we were doing all sorts of interesting topics that they could get their teeth into. But the pen in hand and having to read what they were doing wasn't there anymore, and it was huge success. So that really got me interested to learn what was going on, and it was about that time that I started to do the OU degree, and it just started to fascinate me. The other thing was that I've 4 children, and the oldest child isn't dyslexic, but my second daughter is, and I didn't know till she went to uni. I just knew she didn't do nearly as well as her older sister. My third child is a boy, and he is very, very dyslexic. And again, I didn't know until this all sort of happened in tandem. But I was looking at him, he was then at Castle Rushen, getting into so much bother with forgetting this, forgetting that, not doing this, not doing that, spelling appalling, work awful. And I started to think, I wonder if he's dyslexic. And, it was that really that started it. So from a parent perspective and a teaching perspective, that's where my interest grew. And then it's come to fruition, really, with the educational psychology, tied it all together. And then the nature of my PhD, too, was to do with looking at ways of helping close the learning gap. And that was a particular interest of mine, because when I started working as an educational psychologist, so much of my work was worried from parents saying that the child was being left behind. Their peers were going along, sailing along beautifully. If there were difficulties with literacy, that child's progress often halted, and their peers just took off. And teachers' concerns in that respect too. They were trying everything, but they couldn't get the children to be able to catch up and move along.
Okay,
So.
excellent, thank you. Any questions before we move on to the next section?
Could I just ask a question? What year did you come back once you got your master's in educational psychology? What year was it when you came back to work for the department?
I think it was 2004. Yeah. No, sorry, it must have been 2005.
Thanks. So just moving on to the dyslexia policy that was drafted. I understand that was drafted by yourself. I just want to maybe just take a step back before I ask this question. But so you came in 2005, and then in 2012 you went on to develop the policy. What sort of happened in that 2005 to 2012 period?
Well, my interest in dyslexia and how to help the youngsters who were staying stuck grew. And I can remember an incident where I was in my kitchen racking my brains for how to get a particular teacher, to understand what it must be like to be a dyslexic learner in her class. I could see what was happening to the child, but the teacher couldn't. And I thought they've no idea how difficult it must be, when you're disabled at a letter level, or it is all really at a letter level, to be able to crack on with what you're supposed to be doing, see all your fluent peers doing things so easily, be able to talk to their friends, they'll be able to put very little effort in. You're grinding away here and you still achieve very little. And so out of that, I started to do some training sessions about trying to help children get round the difficulties. And out of that grew one that was called the Dyslexia experience, which is an experiential training session where I disable the audience. And I do make them suffer with that. They have to do tasks. It was disabling them at a letter level, so I thought it was quite pertinent in a way. But they had to work with Greek script rather than our alphabet. So the words were English, but they had to write in different letters, and I gave them an English alphabet and their corresponding letters in Greek, so they had to work it out, but it was so slow for them to do it. I'd give them a piece of Greek script. I've got some here if you're interested, and I can show you one. But it makes your brain really go back to basics while you're trying to work out what on earth is this word, right? I know, because you'll recognise some Greek letters. You'll know what alpha looks like and beta, probably lambda. But other letters, they're so weird that you wouldn't. You'd have to refer back to your plan, and then by the time you've gone back to try and do the work, you'll have lost probably what you've read before. And so it was a good... I thought it was good, and I had a lot of positive feedback from a lot of schools with that. So that took a lot of time and effort. I also did a couple of TES, what are they called? Exhibition. Like they have where all special needs things come together and people give talks. So I was doing talks at that.
Conference. During
that time. Pardon?
Conference.
Well, not quite a conference. I think it was called an exhibition, but anyway, did one in Manchester, one in London, and also I think during that time I'd come across a centre called CALL Scotland, CALL, which stands for the Centre of Augmentative Language and Learning in Scotland, and they're still going, and they have terrific free online resources that were fantastic. They produced one year a wheel of apps that were dyslexia friendly, or if the child's got any language difficulties, they're brilliant. So with it was then Sally Brooks, I think, who was the head of department. She allowed me to go to Scotland and meet the head of that centre, who then took me to two local secondary schools to see absolutely phenomenal practice for how they met dyslexic children's needs, and that was great. That also informed my policy. So yeah, that's.
And were they state schools?
Yes. Yeah.
So that neatly moves us towards the dyslexia policy that you developed. So could you just give us an overview? I think you've given us a bit of the background how you've got to that policy, but what were the reasons for you developing it at that time?
I was asked to do it. We had a policy, 1994 policy, that had been written by Judith Hedges, who was one of the educational psychologists. And I had been sounding off really about the need to stop trying to fix dyslexic learners, to the other ed psychs as well, that it was getting nowhere except eroding the children's self-confidence and self-esteem, and nowhere for the teachers. It was just not getting anywhere. And I felt the need to get people to help the child get round any barriers that there were that were preventing them from being able to make the progress that they ought to be making with their learning. Now I've forgotten the question.
Sorry, can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
You said you were asked to draft this report.
Yes.
Can I just ask who asked you?
That was Sally Brooks.
Sally Brooks.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was the department.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Could you just tell us what worked well with the policy in your opinion?
those teachers that were doing a great job before continued to do a great job. Those teachers that didn't want to know still didn't want to know, basically. I mean, it was a huge disappointment. There was no follow-up, backup, no budget, although it wasn't costly. In my opinion, there was very little that was going to require much monetary input, because at that stage Graham Kinraid was the head of IT. I think he'd taken over from John Thornley, and he was equipping the schools handsomely with laptops and iPads, and so I didn't feel that it was expensive, but there's not even, I don't mean backup, but there was no almost incentive. It's heartbreaking, really, for me it was, because I really thought I was going to change the lives of so many people, because as an ed psych, I could do so much, and I can see, a certain number of children a year, but if that policy had gone in and worked, it would have meant all the teachers could do that. It wasn't going to be just one lone person or maybe two ed psychs doing it or what have you. It would have been a real sea change, but it wasn't.
Can I just jump in on that point again? You say this document was obviously published. How far did you get into the schools to actually with this document? Because I think we've all read it and we all think it's a fantastic report.
Hell of it's a very long document, and I'm sorry,
it is, but
in hindsight it could have been more succinct, but I was desperately trying to explain my rationale for what I was doing. It got in, it was put out to the schools because it went through several stages of consultation, and they were all really positive. I had some lovely, lovely feedback from the public. I had some lovely feedback from within the department of parents with dyslexic children, and some people saying it would change the lives of, and I really did think that it would. Which
so
I think
it got rolled out, to schools across all schools across the island at all levels.
It came into force, and so therefore it.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. It came into force in whatever dates on it, and it said
September
it was up for review.
September 2012.
Yeah, up for review a year later, but there was no time allowed for that, and some of the schools wouldn't have training. I offered training to all the schools, and I was looking before, and I haven't got a record, sadly. I did have a record of the schools that had taken me up on that, but the other schools, it was their attitude of, I'm sorry, but the training's all spoken for, the allocation's all spoken for, and we can't allow the teachers off. There's no money to pay for supply or whatever it would have taken, so they just never had any training.
Okay, I'm going to let Anne just come in.
Can I just clarify then? So there was never a review?
No.
Because there was really nothing to review?
Nothing to review, no.
Okay, thank you.
And by which time that would be, it was in on September 2012. Yeah, it was getting difficult for me at that stage, so yeah.
Okay.
So can I just I'm just listening to everything you've said there. So can you recall whether or not there was an established implementation plan as to what would happen once you'd written the policy? So did the departments in any way support you to say, right, we're going to implement this across the schools in a standardised way, we expect schools to take training, we expect teachers to undertake the training? There's no implementation plan setting that out?
Of, no.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
So we've read through the policy, and it is comprehensive. I've just heard you say that if you were to do it today, you might make it a bit more succinct. What would you do if you were to develop it today? What would you do differently?
Well, there are some specifics that have obviously changed now, because we were still on the cusp of a lot of the IT programs that there are now. I mean, it's phenomenal now what is available for and free for children. Well, and us too, in terms of dictate facility, in terms of audio books that are. Have you heard of WhisperSync technology, where the narrator reads the audio book? And the one I've got, which I can show you at some stage, I didn't know whether there'd be a chance to show things like that, but Sir Ian McKellen reads a series of books that are called Chronicles of Ancient Darkness, and as he reads, the words are highlighted. So not only have you got a terrifically listenable to voice, the words are highlighted. So if you've got a child who's struggling to learn to read, by listening and watching along at the same time, their brain is developing their sight vocabulary by stealth. No effort required at all, but the more they see a word and hear what it says, the more that link will be made in their brain. So it's a wonderful way of helping keep children up to date and up with their peers, give them enjoyment and also help them develop skills. So there are bits and pieces like that that would definitely go in. And I think now, in hindsight, and I know at the time, I wanted to not mention about interventions anymore, because we were I had to write it with an eye on the staging system that there was then. So there was school action plus higher level need. And so it was trying to push this into that, and what would you do at school action and so on. So I think that would change. I don't know what the system is now, what they're doing in the special needs department in terms of that.
And can you tell me, do you know when the dyslexia policy was withdrawn and why?
I don't know. I know, over the last few years, when I've suggested to a parent that they might find it useful to look at it, I'd say probably 5 or 6 years ago, I heard back from one of the parents saying that the department just denied any knowledge of it, that they didn't have a dyslexia policy, was the reply they got. Yeah, so I would, because I have a copy, I'd email it to the parents and say, well, I think probably as far as I'm aware, until they replace it, it's still in force legally, because it was published by them.
The document's definitely in the public domain, because we have a copy. The document is definitely in the public domain. It's definitely there. So if any parent wanted to see that dyslexia policy, it is definitely there if you search it. As I say, it is a comprehensive document, and it's one that we've valued very much, reading what you had to say back in 2012. Anne, over to yourself.
Thank you. The department now uses the term literacy needs rather than dyslexia. What are your thoughts on that terminology?
Well, it's something that I've struggled with as well. As I started off, I think when I was teaching, certainly when I was asking other people that I thought were in the know, the special needs teachers, say at Castle Rushen, dyslexia was seen as something different, special really. But the more I've learned about it, then I think it's unhelpful to think like that, because there's such a wide range of underlying difficulties that give rise to literacy difficulties, which I would call dyslexia, and I would call them all dyslexia, because I've said that in all the training sessions, that for me, I've used the term literally. So difficulty, lexia, words when they're written. So that's what I think dyslexia is. I don't think it's a specific subgroup of literacy difficulties. There are different individual differences that a child may have that give rise to the dyslexia, but no one's, more important or belongs to this special group. So I would say all children and all adults who have any underlying difficulty with either reading and or spelling, and therefore their writing, it would be because they've got something that's giving rise to dyslexia. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it helped me. Otherwise, I'd get pulled into the underlying cause of it, the etiology of dyslexia, which, it's not for me to be. I can do assessments with children and find out that maybe they've got a working memory deficit, and maybe they've got slow speed of processing, and both those factors will have a massive influence on their ability to get fluent reading and spelling skills.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah.
As somebody who's a psychologist, an academic, any reasons why, the Isle of Man is using this term literacy difficulties instead of actually dyslexia? Do you have any understanding or any reasons behind that?
I think my My guess is, when I first came back to work here, John Kermode was the head of special needs and psychology, and he had told the schools they must not use the term dyslexia. And I felt, and I said to him one time, that it was like he was frightened of this can of worms, which was dyslexia, that if the lid was lifted, this is my perception of what he felt, it's not what he said. My perception was that if that lid was lifted, the department was then going to be liable for massive financial input because that dyslexia had to be cured. It had to be addressed and had to be cured.
Do you know when that was? When that?
Sorry?
Do you know what year that was approximately?
Well, I would say probably 2005, 2006.
Okay.
I'm not sure how long John was there for. I'd get a bit lost with the...
So that's how long they've been using this term, literacy difficulties. It's been there for 17, 18 years.
Years before I came here, dyslexia was a word that you could say possibly that a child had dyslexic tendencies, but you couldn't say they were dyslexic.
Okay.
So it's a word that causes trouble. All right, that's why I sent you the Does Dyslexia Exist
Yes.
article, because it's a really well-written, I feel it's a well-written article, and I agree with everything they say in that. They're not saying there's no such thing as dyslexia. They're saying that it's a social construct, and I think initially I can understand why it might have arisen, because they were trying to work out why these young men, I think there are two in particular, who were from well-to-do families, had very good schooling, were very, very intellectually bright, but couldn't read and write. And that's what I feel started that subgroup, that they were somehow different to the children who might have been from poorer backgrounds, not had much schooling, illiterate parents and things. So I think there was that initial differentiation between the two, but that's not the case anymore. All our children go to school. They have good teaching. They have reliable teaching. And yet you've got this massive spread of children that are not succeeding because their literacy difficulties are not developing well.
Okay, we might come back to that article in a minute. Next, Sharon.
Are you aware of any other jurisdictions that use the word literacy needs rather than dyslexia?
No,
is it a common approach?
Pardon?
Is that a common approach to this for other jurisdictions?
I wouldn't take any issue with it as long as those literacy difficulties are addressed. I wouldn't really mind what it's called, except that public perception is somehow, I think, of dyslexia. People have heard of dyslexia, and it means that you're not stupid. And I mean, this is another fallacy, isn't it? Or another common belief too, is that somehow, if you're dyslexic, it means that you're intelligent with literacy difficulties. If you've got literacy difficulties, it's likely that you're not as intelligent as this dyslexic group, and you've got literacy difficulties. Well, as far back as, I can't remember if it's 1984 or 1994, there's a lot of research done by a man called Stanovich, and he finds, and he's quoted everywhere, that there is absolutely no link between dyslexia and levels of cognitive intelligence. No link at all. So in the dyslexic population, you've got a normal spread, normal distribution of intelligence. You've got some very bright dyslexic individuals, some not very bright individuals, and the main spreads under the bell curve in the middle. And a good example of that is that the Down syndrome population will always score very low on a cognitive assessment because of their genetic difficulties. But within that population, you'll have some children who are dyslexic and some who aren't. You get some Down syndrome children who can read and write beautifully and others that can't. So that, to me, brings that home a little bit, that there's no link between dyslexia and intelligence, but that is responsible. I think that historic link that was there has a lot to answer for. And again, I've forgotten what you asked me.
Well, really, it was basically, do you think it makes a difference by what we call it?
We call it, well, yeah, because it's society that's slow to move. Maybe that if everyone was called dyslexic, then maybe, I don't know, really. I don't know. I don't mind what you call it. It makes no difference to me. It's more to do with helping those children achieve their potential in a text-based environment at school. And if they've got a specific... And at times I've used specific learning difficulty, because that too pinpoints that it's not a global learning difficulty. I'm not saying this child's got learning difficulties across the board, but it's specific to reading and spelling. Or sometimes just to spelling if the reading skills have developed. So that's, I found a helpful term as well.
So, well, first of all, we'd like to thank you for sending us the article, Does Dyslexia Exist?
Yeah.
But the committee really would like to know, what are the key points you'd like us to take away from that research?
I think the key point would be that any child who's struggling with their learning because of literacy difficulties needs the input that you'll be prepared to do for any other group of children within that respect. I think. I don't know what else was in it. Yeah.
It basically
yes,
gave,
the allocation of resources would be the same across. And another interesting point that might help is the access arrangements at GCSE time. That the access arrangements, if you've got a diagnosis from an educational psychologist of dyslexia, it wouldn't make a whit of difference. The allocation of resources for access arrangements is based purely on functional level of scores. It wants the functional level of your reading, it wants the functional level of your spelling, it wants the functional level of your speed of handwriting. Doesn't mention, I mean, yes, dyslexia may well be mentioned in some of the descriptors there. They may say there's a boy with dyslexia who's got blah, 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 but it's based on those functional levels of their skills that are necessary for whatever exam they're doing.
I mean, I have to say it was a fascinating paper. I've got it in front of me. But it talks about it in the paper you sent us that they argue that attempts to distinguish between categories of dyslexia and poor reader or reading disabled are scientifically unsupportable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting. It's one of those papers and one of those reports that you have to read several times.
Yes.
To try and understand.
You do. It's. Yeah, but I found that interesting.
Yeah, it's something I think I'll read it again before we publish our final report, because it is all about identification. It is all about the support and then trying to put...
Tailoring the support to that identification, because it's not just a matter of saying this child is struggling to learn to read. They also need to know, has that child got a working memory deficit? Have they got slow speed of processing? Have they got... I mean, the other big one is phonological awareness. Do you know what I mean by that? So it's
Please explain it for people.
It's the ability of the brain to be able to perceive the difference in the sounds of our language. So, and then at school age, obviously, that we translate those sounds into letters, and so a child who's learning to read has to be able to crack the code, so they learn that shape would be an A sound, and that shape would be a B sound, and so on. So it's to do with that's phonology. Yes, I have a bee in my bonnet about that, but that can be an underlying difficulty. If you haven't got good phonological awareness, if your brain hasn't developed that, then that will make it more difficult for you to learn to read using a phonological method, because your brain cannot perceive the difference. You could be saying to a child, oh no, that's a not a n, and if they're not seeing, they wouldn't, their brain is just hearing the same sound, so it's difficult. But what happens is that the children then who are perceived as finding it difficult to get on phonologically, they do more phonics, and they'll do phonics in the corridor with the helper that comes in once a week, and they'll miss their lessons because they're out doing a phonics sheet with Mrs. So-and-so down the corridor. The ability for the brain to develop phonological awareness happens in a window of development in the first year of life. Once that window's shut, you can, till you're blue in the face, tell a child, no, it's not a Their brain doesn't hear it. It's not that the brain does hear it. It hears the sound, but it can't perceive the difference between the two.
I was
just going to say, so kind of to sum that up, the way I'm thinking about it from what you said is that, if you can't teach a child the way they learn, then they
shouldn't be in my class. They should be in class 69 down there with Mrs. So-and-so.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to screening and diagnosis. Dawn.
Thank you. The role of an educational psychologist enables you to diagnose dyslexia. I understand that correctly.
It enables me to identify that a child has some difficulties with specific learning, whatever we're talking about, yes. And as I say, I have continued to use the word dyslexia in my reports because it seems to be needed by the schools, it's needed by people almost to take it seriously, to say this child just hasn't just got learning difficulties, they're dyslexic. So yes, I have.
So when you do your master's qualification in educational psychology, is dyslexia the term that they would use during that?
During that? I'd be hard pressed to remember. I don't remember anything specifically about diagnosing dyslexia, because the definition that I've used in that policy, 1999 one that was done by the BPS working party, that was a book that was given on our reading list there, because one of the people in that was a professor who was head of educational psychology when I did my training. And so that definition is so broad that it encompasses, you can encompass anybody, and it's really helpful for me in my role with that. Am I going off tack for answering your question?
No, it's just to get a wider understanding really of how dyslexia sits within the professional status as being an educational psychologist. Well, I think one of the things that I picked up on when I was doing a little bit of research is the professional body for educational psychologists makes reference to the ability of educational psychologists to provide a diagnosis of dyslexia. So within that information, online information, it very clearly states that that is part of the role. And is that your understanding?
Maybe. I don't know. I'd be sad if it was, because I feel, as I've said in the policy, I feel that teachers, particularly reception year 1 teachers, are excellent at picking out children who are likely to have problems. So, that's why I said in the document that I feel if you're going to restrict it to educational psychologists having to do something, again, it suggests that there's something magic that I can produce that will state whether this child's dyslexic or just got reading difficulties. And I can't do that, because there is no difference, in my opinion, between the two.
So that leads quite neatly actually into my next question. So I'll probably just take it back a step. You just talked about reception year 1, the teachers being able to identify children at that age. What are your thoughts of the teachers screening all children at that age to try and identify children who may have those difficulties that could ultimately be dyslexia, and whether that screening process, if applied to all children, would then perhaps lead into an educational psychologist assessment?
What the screening test was. I think it would be useful to have a record of how well a child is able to make progress on specific markers for learning to read. So whether a child's able to recite the alphabet, whether they're able, this is in maybe reception, whether they know any of the letter sounds, whether they can read any of the words, and then going into year 1, how much, and I think the teachers probably, they used to keep a record of how many high frequency words a child could read fluently. So they usually, well, they did have, and again, I'm out of it now for 10 years, there would be a record, and of spelling too, whether the child's making normal progress with those what I'd call lower order skills for reading and for writing. But screening, I don't know. The only example that I've got of a screening test is the dyslexia screening test, the DST, which has got, in my opinion, bizarre things in it. That one of them is there's a special plastic, odd-shaped instrument that you place part of it in the middle of the child's back and tap it to see if the child moves forward. And I think, what on earth has that got to do with learning to read and spell? So no, I mean, we haven't talked about compensation yet, whether or not you're going to ask me about what is a compensating dyslexic, but that also is crucial to me, that people understand that the outcome for different learners will vary on all the individual differences that those children have. So you can never say how a child's going to progress. I've often been called in to consult about children in end of year 3, beginning of year 4, where a child started to exhibit signs of anxiety and learning gaps opening up and so on. And that's indicative of the stress that's being caused, because years 1, 2 and 3 a child's learning to read, and then the curriculum shifts at year 4, and it's based on the fact that it presumes that children by then can read, so they start to read to learn. And if a child's skills have not developed sufficiently fluently, they'll fall off their perch at that point, and it'll become horribly stressful for them because they're not able to access what their fluent peers can do. Other children might sail through that, fall off at year 7 when they go to secondary school, when all of a sudden you haven't got your favourite teacher with you all year, you've got umpteen teachers you've got to deal with and homework written on the board, and it balloons, so children may fall off their perch then. And so if I came across, one example is a girl that I saw early on in my career here, who became known to the department in year 11, because all of a sudden she started to school refuse, and it was blowing up everywhere. And the department said, we didn't know there was any problem, we didn't know. And she was obviously dyslexic, very dyslexic, but all through school her difficulties had been masked by her peer group support. She had a brilliant peer group, and her peers used to write for her, they'd make sure she had this and that and the other. She was a very clever girl, but all of a sudden GCSEs were looming, and that wasn't going to be happening. You know, that was the cause of worry. So she would be a compensating dyslexic. She was dyslexic from the time she's born, whatever difficulties, and I don't remember her specific difficulties, but they'd be there all the time. But she'd compensated sufficiently so you wouldn't know she was having any problems until the curriculum demands become such that they exceed the fluency of the skills that have been developed. So a screening test for her wouldn't have noticed anything. And as I say, I don't going back to that question, it depends what's in the screening test. I would approve of a record being kept of a child's progress through the basics of learning to read and spell, mainly because if the child's struggling to start with, then picks up, then falls off later on up through school, if the records are there, you can look back and say, well, it's likely that there's an underlying difficulty because they had a difficulty to start with. And the definition that's in the policy is that if a child learns if reading and or spelling skills develops slowly or with great difficulty, then dyslexia is...
Can I just come back, because you mentioned possible tests at the age of at year 3 and 4. Again, can you just explain what age that is? At what age do you feel that children should be tested? Is it a primary school or towards the end of...
Yes, I would say at the end of each year.
End of each year in primary school?
Primary school.
Okay, and then having anything identified and
just that skill set.
Okay.
Because I don't think the schools have done spellings for many years either now. It's my perception anyway that they no longer give spellings out or do spelling tests. So difficult to know, really. If you haven't got that information, it's difficult to be able to spot somebody that isn't making average progress.
Okay, perfect. John?
So just to sort of finish off on that then, so listening to what you've explained there, is it's not necessarily about a screening test, it's about relying on the professionalism and the expertise of the teacher and the relationship with the child, keeping the records and looking at that in a holistic way to perhaps go to a further stage, which may or may not be a formal diagnosis. Is that the way that you would envisage the route?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I don't know. There wouldn't be the manpower for that, I wouldn't think, for anybody to come in and do assessments. When you've got over 20% of the children having those difficulties, that's a big number.
So without perhaps going down the formal diagnosis route then, is thinking about the teacher with the relationship with the child, understanding where the child's at, perhaps upskilling the teacher then in the support mechanisms as opposed to going formal diagnosis.
There's a big gulf, isn't there, in teacher training. There's big issues around that, I think, in that they need an understanding. And I'm not sure what goes on. I think the Isle of Man College does do some training on dyslexia, but I don't know.
Okay, that actually
moves on. There
on.
need to be somebody prepared to look at that information with the knowledge to be able to interpret it.
Okay, well that moves us on quite nicely to teacher training and support.
Yeah, so we were trying to identify what sort of training should be on offer for teachers to identify and support pupils with dyslexia.
Yeah. Well, I think all teachers, it should be in the teacher training that they are doing, that they learn about how children learn to read and write. I mean, I can remember myself teaching, and with shame, but thinking, if this child, somebody said to me once, at a parents' evening, my child's got a working memory deficit and they need things to be repeated to them, and my initial thought was, well, gosh, I'm too busy teaching. I can't be doing this. So
that was
I've been there, and
really
so with the best will in the world, it's difficult because you've got subject teachers at secondary that are trying to teach their subject. The best thing that I have seen happen is when a child is skilled up sufficiently in alternative ways of access, going to secondary school and then not being noticed, because they're not sitting passively saying, I can't read that, I can't do this, I can't do that. They're saying, is it all right if I do it this way? And the teacher's very likely to say, yes, crack on, because they're busy. But if you sit and say, I can't read this, then the reply is going to be, shouldn't be in my class then, you should be in a set where Mrs. So-and-so can help the readers and that sort of thing. So I'm off track
that
again,
was my next question, really, from what you just said. It's not about children being missed, but about time and resource to support children. It's not that they're not identified, it's just that the time and resource isn't there.
Well, I'd say in a lot of cases they're identified but wrongly, and my son, for years at primary school, I was reassured. He's a boy. That was the first thing. He's lazy, and nothing could have been further from the truth. So and that was, and I wouldn't be unusual in that I was trusting the teachers. They were the professionals and they knew best. I wasn't a primary school teacher. I had no idea, so I thought he was lazy.
Okay.
And in secondary school, he was naughty. I mean, by that stage, he was dyslexic children when they're not identified, or whatever we're going to call them, children with reading and literacy difficulties. When they're not identified, they're going to go mainly one of two ways. One, they'll start to act in and become withdrawn, and you won't hear them, and won't see them, and then they'll have time off, and they'll have tummy aches, not want to go to school, and then they'll school refuse eventually, or they'll act out to deflect other people's view of them. So better to be thrown out of class because you're the class clown than to be, what, you can't do that, you stupid or something. And this is their peers, not the teacher. So, yeah.
Okay. Anything else, Anne?
No, it was just last. Some of our research has shown there's some schools in the UK who use dyslexia-friendly teaching methods for all students. What are your views on that approach?
Yes, I agree. What's good teaching for a dyslexic student is good for everybody. And there's an illustration of that when I was working in Surrey, and I went into a junior school to observe a child, and observed him during one lesson, and noticed another child in there who was very, very dyslexic. He couldn't read and write. And this was probably year 4. And at the end of the lesson, we talked about the child I was supposed to be there for. And then I asked the teacher, how do you cope with so-and-so? Because he hadn't been referred to me. And she said, oh, he's really easy. She said, he's the starting place for my planning. Because I know if I plan a lesson that he can access, everybody can access it. And it's usually in a really fun way. Now, it's turned on its head here. Most people start with the brightest, they're planning, and then they differentiate down to the ones who are less able, and then in the end you've got the table that's working with Mrs. So-and-so over there. It's likely to have a missing words worksheet or something, and it's heartbreaking to see. Sometimes the brightest children in your room will be on that table, but they are not able, they're not facilitated to access what the rest of the class are doing.
Okay, excellent. Just a couple of more questions. I just want to ask my colleagues if they've got anything further to ask before I go into my little piece.
Just to, if you could just clarify for me, when you were just talking about access arrangements earlier on, for GCSEs, you talked about functional level of scores, and I didn't really understand what that meant.
Well, so if you had a reading score that was below average, so a standardised score below 85, then I would say, and the exam boards would say, that you are not functionally able to access the information in the exam paper. If you were trying to read the exam paper, you can't get at that information, so you would get access arrangements to make sure that you could get at that information. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to test your level of geography or science or whatever they're trying to access. So it's been the case for years that you could have an electronic paper, sit with headphones, and you could listen to the computer read the paper to you. If you had a spelling score below 85, you would be functionally unable to record what you wanted to say to the exam person. So that's a functional level of a score. It's not functional for you to use that method of pen on paper and reading your exam.
And so how does a child get that functional score level? Is that through the formal diagnosis route, or is that done in another way?
It's not a formal diagnosis, but it would be an assessment. And if you have a look at the access arrangement book, have you seen the access arrangement books?
I've looked at various access policies from different awarding bodies. Is that what you mean by that?
Yes, so the JCQ one is the one that's sort of probably most forward thinking, and the others that I've seen tend to follow suit. Scotland is light years ahead of JCQ even. They've been doing this for years, but the JCQ exam access book, it's changed over the years. It used to be that if an educational psychologist wrote a report and reported those functional scores, that the schools would take that and use that to apply for access arrangements, or not, because they've been very slow on doing that. But now the exam boards say that there has to be like a in-house assessor. So it could be an educational psychologist that the schools are buying in. It could be somebody with a level, I don't know, level 7 or something in assessment. But the latest booklet that I downloaded, because again I'm a bit out of touch, but I downloaded bits of this latest one, and they talk about, so you've got your SENCO, Special Educational Needs Coordinator. There should also be a deputy SENCO or an assistant a SENCO, and then something called an Access Arrangements Coordinator in the schools. Because it's a massive job, and the difference that I noticed when I went to the two schools in Scotland was that the Access Arrangements Coordinator was somebody who was going out looking for children that might benefit, rather than waiting passively for somebody to come along, or a teacher to suggest this child might, or the parent to be banging on the door hard enough to get the schools to listen. And then the schools will do an assessment and see what the scores are on the assessment, and then if the scores aren't high enough, they'll say no, you can't have access arrangements, the boards wouldn't allow it. Whereas in Scotland it was the reverse. There'd be people going out and looking for children and finding out what that child might need in order to help them make the best possible attempt at their exams. And then if it didn't meet the criteria exactly, the access coordinator would write a case for that child and apply to the exam boards. It was often accepted that they would take that, because I think the access arrangements are mostly online, and if you put in a score that's just above the average, and remember the average range is massive in these tests, 85 to 115, so if you've got a child who's got a score of 86, the online application will reject it because you've gone into the average band. But you know that somebody with a score of 86 is really poor at reading, so it would need somebody then to actually take that case up and write a bit about it, or say what's been going on. So I was surprised, but that's really much more complex than it used to be. But they've got to be very careful, haven't they? In England anyway, for potential of being sued for discrimination if they don't give a child what they're entitled to with access arrangements.
Okay, excellent.
Just a final point on that. So I'm just aware in a couple of different countries when it comes to access arrangements for exams, in particular where a child has got dyslexia or difficulties, particular learning difficulties, that sometimes instead of asking the child to sit for perhaps an extended period of time to get extra time, is in fact they undertake shorter exam periods because their focus is better in those shorter periods. I wonder if you've ever heard of anything like that.
Well, I think they do allow breaks, certainly in JCQ, and I would imagine the other exam boards, you can have breaks, so the child would be in a room on their own so they didn't disturb the other students. And whoever's invigilating could allow them to work for a quarter of an hour and then have a 5-minute wander around and then come back. So yes, that would be not unusual, I don't think.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a couple of final questions from us. I suppose the first one is, if you were in our position, is there anything that you would recommend to the department with regard to its approach to dyslexia and other learning difficulties?
Well, I'd say training, but then you'd have to make it mandatory, wouldn't you? I mean, because it's, and then I'm reminded of you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So it's difficult.
Would you ask to pick up one of your own comments? Would you actually look at those access referral officers, to go out and find children who need the support? Would you have anything of that?
Yeah. Well, I did put together a wish list, and one of the main things on that is the role of the SENCO. And I'm not sure, because I've been out of it now for 10 years, I'm not sure it may have improved since, but my experience particularly for primary school SENCOs was that it was a job that was sometimes almost foisted on somebody, and they've got a full teaching timetable. So how on earth somebody could do a proper SENCO role with a teaching load? And I suppose you could say, well, if they're in a very small school, maybe with only two groups in the school, fair enough, but there's not many going to be going through. But in you know, a good-sized primary school, the Senko role would be all-consuming in that, if it's done properly. The Senkos should be trained, and I don't know, 10 years ago they weren't. There were class teachers doing it, but there should be, and I think by law in England, the Senkos have to have done this, what's it called? Senko National Professional Qualification, an NPQ. And they have to do that within 3 years of their appointment. So I don't know what the case is here. You'll be more informed than I am with that.
Okay, we'll have a look at that.
Deputy Senko for a secondary school. So a Senko full-time, they should be on the senior management team, because their decision-making ability needs to be up there with other people. Deputy Senko, and then the AAC, their Access Arrangement Coordinator.
Okay.
And then, because it's a massive, massive job, so record keeping right the way through school, so that you've got the evidence to give the exam boards. Because now, I was amazed. Well, it's lovely to see actually, but in order to qualify for a computer reader, because that's what the exam boards have been preferring for years, rather than a human reader, which is very resource heavy, because you have to have a child in a separate room with an adult to read the paper. It's much better, and better for the child too, to be able to control their own listening ability by having it on screen, so that it doesn't need to be in a separate room. They've got headphones on, they won't disturb other people. And when that started to be the case, a child had to have functional level of reading, single word identification of below 85, and or speed of reading below 85, and or reading comprehension score below 85, to be able to, any one of those would have done. And then slowly over the years that's lessened, and this year the access arrangements, all they ask for if it's the child's normal way of working. So it's removed that, which is fantastic, because there'll be many, many children in that middle layer whose scores are within the average range, but they're not easily accessing the information in the text. So now they can listen if they want to. But it's going to be such a sea change for the schools, because in my opinion, those sorts of ways of working should be going on in tandem from the time the child's reception year 1. They're struggling to read, let them listen at the same time. Let them listen first, then read. Let them listen at the same time. No harm in it. It'll just help everything to develop. And then people keep records so that the exam boards can see, right, this child from year 1 has been listening and benefiting from listening. No problem, they can listen in their exams.
Excellent. Final question really from the panel is just to see if there's anything else you'd like to add, or any other information you'd like to give the committee.
I don't think so. I've probably talked too much.
No, it's fascinating. It's surprising. It's a good conversation when an hour goes very, very quickly. Doc, did you want to ask them?
Just a quick one, actually. Did you complete your wish list there? And if so, would you send it to us?
My wishes, did I complete them? No, I didn't.
Would you send your wish list to the committee?
It's on my computer. I can give you this. I don't think there's anything rude in it.
Well, Dr Monroe, on behalf of the committee, can I thank you for giving up your valuable time today to come and speak to the committee. The committee now will sit in private.